Here's an engaging hook to draw attention to the story. Hook. Imagine stepping into a hospital where nothing feels right, where the lights flicker, the walls seem to breathe, and something sinister lurks just beyond your sight. What happens when the line between the living and the dead starts to blur, and you're trapped inside with no way out? Dr. Carter is about to discover that the truth hiding behind the hospital's sterile doors is more terrifying than any diagnosis he could have imagined. Are you ready to face what lies within? The story begins on a quiet, ordinary day at the hospital. Dr. Carter, a seasoned physician, moves through the bustling halls, greeting colleagues and patients with a tired but practiced smile. The atmosphere is familiar. Nurses rush by, doctors discuss cases, and the smell of antiseptic lingers in the air. Despite the constant motion around him, everything seems controlled, predictable, yet slight unease lingers, unnoticed at first. Dr. Carter is exhausted, but his professionalism keeps him focused on his rounds. As the day continues, sense of routine settles in, like the hospital's world where everything has its place. That peace is broken when Mrs. Ellison, an older woman with distant, eerie calm, enters the emergency room. Dr. Carter notices her unusual stillness. She moves too quietly, as if she's floating. Her presence doesn't match the urgency of the hospital setting. Mrs. Ellison seems almost too composed for someone coming in with medical issue. There's something off about her, disquieting calm that unnerves him. As she approaches the check-in desk, Dr. Carter's concern grows. There's feeling in the air now, something strange that seems to emanate from her. What is she hiding, and what's about to unfold? And just as the hospital's ordinary routine starts to shift, the eerie tone sets in. Something isn't right. This unsettling introduction leads to the next stage of tension. When Dr. Carter begins to investigate further, the situation quickly escalates. As Dr. Carter finishes his rounds, a soft click of the doors catches his attention. Mrs. Ellison, a frail woman in her late 50s, steps inside. Her movements are slow, deliberate, almost too careful, as though she's trying not to disturb the space around her. At first glance, nothing seems out of the ordinary. She's wearing a loose coat, her face tired but composed, yet there's something about her eyes, distant, as if she's somewhere else or perhaps nowhere at all. The air feels colder as she approaches the desk, her footsteps barely audible against the hospital's. Dr. Carter takes her in with calm demeanor, asking the usual questions. What's brought her in today? How is she feeling? But her answers don't align with her appearance. Her voice is soft, almost too calm, and she doesn't seem to register the urgency around her. She mentions feeling faint, but there's no obvious sign of distress. When he checks her vitals, everything is normal, yet she seems distant, detached from the world around her. Despite his initial assessment, Dr. Carter is unsettled. Her mannerisms, her unblinking gaze, the eerie stillness in her voice, nothing about this feels right. She begins to describe strange sensations, like she's not entirely present in her own body, like she's floating. Dr. Carter dismisses it, at first a symptom of stress, but something lingers in the back of his mind. Why is she acting like this? His concern deepens when Mrs. Ellison begins to speak cryptically about the others, and of the time has come. She seems to be saying things that don't make sense in the context of her visit. As Dr. Carter tries to keep his composure, his thoughts race. Who is she really at this moment? Dr. Carter's curiosity is piqued. Something is happening here, but he can't yet figure out what. And just as he begins to question whether it's all in his head, something shifts in the atmosphere. An invisible weight that makes him question his next move. Dr. Carter's initial calm begins to crack as Mrs. Ellison's behavior becomes more peculiar. She sits quietly in her room, but there's coldness in the air, silence that feels out of place in the busy hospital. Dr. Carter reviews her medical chart again, but everything appears normal. No history of mental illness, no signs of physical distress. Yet the unease builds as he notices her odd mannerisms. The way she stares at him without blinking, her voice soft but oddly detached. She's still speaking about floating, about being outside herself, and yet her physical condition shows no sign of the typical symptoms one might expect. There's faint smell of antiseptic in the air, but for a moment it's replaced by something else, something darker. Mrs. Ellison mentions name, one Dr. Carter doesn't recognize, and her hands twitch involuntarily, her pupils dilate unnaturally, and her breathing slows to an almost imperceptible rate. Her condition is deteriorating, but not in a way that makes sense. He reaches for his phone to call for nurse, but when he turns back, Mrs. Ellison is no longer sitting in her bed. She's standing by the window, staring out into the night, her back to him. The room has become colder and the silence deepens. It feels as though time has stopped. His breath catches as he approaches her. Mrs. Ellison, are you all right? He asks, but she doesn't respond. That's when the whispers start, faint, almost inaudible at first, but growing louder. Dr. Carter's heart races. His instincts scream at him to leave, but he forces himself to stay. The sensation of being watched overwhelms him. And when he finally turns to look at the door, he notices a figure standing in the hallway, a man in dark suit, eyes glinting in the dim light, watching them both. He doesn't say a word, but something about his presence sends shiver down Dr. Carter's spine. Dr. Carter's sense of unease escalates as he tries to make sense of the situation. Mrs. Ellison is no longer in the bed, her strange absence unsettling him. His heart pounds in his chest as he looks at the figure by the window, her expression distant, almost as though she's unaware of his presence. The room feels heavier now, the once familiar sterile scent replaced by an unnerving cold. Despite his best efforts to remain calm, Dr. Carter can't shake the feeling that something is terribly wrong. He approaches Mrs. Ellison cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the silent room. As he calls her name, she turns slowly, her eyes wide and vacant. It's like she's no longer the same person. Her voice, when it comes, is hollow and distant, her words coming in fragmented bursts. It's too late. They're coming. I've seen them. Dr. Carter's pulse quickens. The room feels darker, the shadows stretching unnaturally. He glances toward the hallway, where the man in the suit stood earlier, but the figure is gone. His instincts tell him to call for help, but something holds him back. The words Mrs. Ellison spoke linger in his mind, each one carrying sense of finality. Who is coming, and what does she mean by it? It's too late. He grabs his phone, ready to dial for assistance, but before he can press any buttons, Mrs. Ellison collapses to the floor, her body convulsing violently. Panic surges through him as he rushes to her side, but when he touches her hand, it's ice cold, unnaturally cold. He checks her pulse, but there's nothing. She's alive, but there's strange, otherworldly stillness to her body. Dr. Carter's anxiety grows as the situation spirals out of control. Mrs. Ellison lies motionless on the floor, her body unnaturally cold, yet he can still sense faint pulse beneath his fingers. The hospital around him seems with tension, the walls closing in as if the very building is holding its breath. Despite every instinct telling him to run, Dr. Carter can't leave her. He needs answers, and some force won't let him walk away. His mind races through every possible diagnosis, but nothing fits. He calls for a nurse, but when he looks up, the hallway is empty. It's as though the entire hospital has suddenly gone quiet, swallowed by an unnatural stillness. Dr. Carter's sense of unease grows as he begins searching through Mrs. Ellison's medical records, desperate to find something that will explain her bizarre symptoms. Her file is thick, yet there are glaring gaps. No records of her previous visits, no history of this strange behavior. It's as though her entire past has been erased. Suddenly he's jolted by a loud noise, something shuffling just outside the room. His heart skips beat, and he steps toward the door. Through the crack in the doorframe, he catches sight of the man in a suit again, standing at the end of the hallway, his face expressionless. Dr. Carter's pulse races as he watches the figure slowly approach. It's then that he realizes the truth. The man has been watching Mrs. Ellison, and now he's watching him. Dr. Carter must make a decision. He needs to find out who this man is and what role he plays in the mystery unfolding before him. But when he looks back to Mrs. Ellison, something has changed. She's no longer lying still. Her eyes are open, but they aren't hers. They're darker, colder, as if something else is looking through them. Dr. Carter's pulse pounds in his ears as he approaches the door, his mind racing with questions. The man in the suit stands just outside the room, staring at him with cold, unblinking eyes. The tension between them feels palpable, like the air is thickening around them. Dr. Carter is about to speak, but the words stick in his throat. The man doesn't move, doesn't acknowledge him, just stands there as if waiting for something. Dr. Carter knows he can't back down now. Whatever this is, it's more than a medical mystery. It's something far darker. As he steps closer, the man finally speaks, his voice low and steady. "She is not what you think she is," he says, his words sending chill down Dr. Carter's spine. Before Dr. Carter can respond, the lights flicker and the entire hospital seems to shudder. The strange coldness that has been lingering in the air intensifies, and the man's presence feels suffocating. "You should leave," the man warns. "It's too late for her. And too late for you." Dr. Carter's confusion deepens, but the man's words resonate. What does he mean? Who is Mrs. Ellison really? The hospital seems to close in on him, its walls pressing in, and his sense of reality begins to fracture. The man's cryptic warning only fuels Dr. Carter's determination to uncover the truth. As the man steps aside, revealing the now silent Mrs. Ellison in the doorway, Dr. Carter feels a cold wave of dread wash over him. Her eyes are still unnaturally dark, her gaze fixed on him like an inescapable trap. Suddenly, the air is thick with an oppressive force, and the room grows unbearably still. The air grows heavier as Dr. Carter stands frozen, facing Mrs. Ellison. Her once calm demeanor is now replaced with a haunting intensity, her gaze unblinking and cold. As he steps closer, he feels an overwhelming sense of unease, as if something inside her has shifted. Her eyes, once dull, now seem to reflect something far darker, something ancient and malevolent. The man in the suit, who has been watching them both in silence, steps back into the shadows as if content with the unfolding events. Mrs. Ellison finally speaks, her voice sounding nothing like it did before. It's deeper, colder, laced with an unnatural calm that sends shiver down Dr. Carter's spine. "I warn you," she says, her words laced with chilling certainty. This was never about healing. You never stood chance." Her words hit him like punch to the gut. The hospital around them seems to blur, the walls bending inward, the lights flickering in and out. Dr. Carter's mind races. This isn't just medical case anymore. He's facing something supernatural, something that defies all logic and understanding. As he watches her, the room shifts. The sterile, familiar hospital walls seem to melt away, replaced by an eerie, shadow-filled environment that feels impossibly vast and foreign. The once comforting of the hospital has been replaced by low, constant drums, sound that feels like warning. Dr. Carter takes a step back, trying to steady himself. The man in the suit's words echo in his mind. Too late, the sense of dread swells, but his determination refuses to waver. He needs to understand what's happening here, why Mrs. Ellison is no longer herself, and what is behind this madness. Dr. Carter's breath catches in his throat as the room shifts, the walls pressing in closer. Mrs. Ellison, once frail and confused patient, is now something else entirely. The transformation is subtle at first, but the change is undeniable. Her body shudders as though struggling against an unseen force, her eyes glowing with faint, unnatural light. The shadows in the room stretch toward her, bending to her will. Dr. Carter steps back, but his legs feel like they're frozen to the ground, as if the very space around him is trapping him. The man in the suit has gone now, leaving Dr. Carter alone with this horrifying version of Mrs. Ellison. Her voice reverberates in the air, no longer sounding human, but more like whisper from the depths of something ancient. You should have listened. She hisses, her words sending chills through his body. This place, it's where it all began. The weight of her words hits him with brutal force. Everything that's happening now, the twisted atmosphere, the strange happenings, the figure in the suit. It's all connected, but to what Dr. Carter can barely process, the sheer horror in front of him as Mrs. Ellison continues, her voice growing stronger, more insistent. The others are here, and they're coming for you. He looks around frantically, but there's no escape. The hospital, once place of healing, is now prison. Its sterile corridors twisted and unfamiliar. The sound of footsteps echo in the distance, relentless rhythm growing louder, as though something is closing in on him. He wants to run, to escape, but he knows deep down that he's too late. Whatever force is at work here, it's already claimed him as part of its plan. Dr. Carter's heart races as the last remnants of his sanity hang by thread. The hospital is no longer a place of healing. It's nightmare. The walls pulse with an eerie rhythm, and the air is thick with an otherworldly force that seems to feed on fear. Mrs. Ellison stands before him, her body now an empty vessel, puppet controlled by something far beyond human understanding. The transformation that began with her is now complete. She's no longer patient. She's conduit, gateway to something ancient and malevolent. As he stumbles through the hospital's twisted halls, Dr. Carter finally pieces together the horrifying truth. The hospital itself is a living entity, drawing power from the darkness that has consumed Mrs. Ellison. The whispers he's heard, the shadows that lurk in every corner. They're all part of the same force, and it's closing in on him. With every step, the hospital seems to shift, the layout changing unpredictably as if it's alive and aware of his movements. The door slams shut behind him, and the lights flicker out, plunging him into darkness. Panic rises, but Dr. Carter forces himself to stay focused. There's only one way to stop this, one final confrontation that will either destroy the darkness or allow it to consume everything in its path. He reaches the heart of the hospital, the place where everything began, its room he's never seen before, a place hidden in the deepest recesses of the building. Inside, he finds the source of the hospital's evil. Dark pulsing force that's been waiting for someone to awaken, and Mrs. Ellison's transformation was the key, but now Dr. Carter must make choice. Will he destroy the force and risk everything, or will he give in to the darkness and join it?